somebody grows up to be gay or trans, there were environmental influences that led them to that. As long as this person's living a happy, healthy life, I don't have any issue with that. And ultimately, like trying to pinpoint, is this biological or is this sociological? We're never gonna pinpoint those down exactly. So like, I don't know, who cares, right?
I consider myself left leaning and, pretty accepting of all sorts of lifestyles. And
Yeah.
my issue, to use that term with the current gender ideology or like transgender movement, it doesn't make perfect logical sense, like gender to me. And it seems like you could reach the same outcome with, for example, abolishing gender, where there aren't these specific roles based on the sex you were born as,
Mhm.
that would lead to essentially the same outcomes and like the same freedoms. And I feel like it's actually quite a bit more logical and digestible for like the average person, which I think would be beneficial to, both trans people as a whole, and then also like the left movement. If you could win people over on the trans issues, on the trans issue, and have the same outcome where it doesn't hurt trans people, it would be beneficial. It's an issue that doesn't affect me. It's so funny how this is such a huge issue, but it affects so little people. As far as actually being trans, and then
Mhm.
the like actual damage is nearly non-existent.
Trying to add on to a couple of the things you said, when you get into these kind of like really trying to like logically understand gender, like you're going to get into a mess. And I would agree with that. I mean, because gender is inherently this like social phenomenon, with respect to how we interact with people, like there's always going to be subjectivities and inconsistencies. Taking the angle of like this gender concept is really incoherent if you really put it under a magnifying glass. So like, why are we trying to care so much about it and force it on people? But there's a couple problems with kind of just taking like a strict gender abolitionist approach, and not considering anything else that sometimes you kind of like run into. Suppose that everybody, just like as a society, we agree tomorrow these gender roles, they're hurting us, we don't really like them, they're not really serving us, let's get rid of them. Everybody just agrees to be identify as non-binary or whatever. If we were to do that tomorrow, is that going to do anything to address like material relations between the people we currently today call men and women, wage gaps or employment discrimination, or even just like access to like different kinds of rights that somebody would have with respect to like parental leave as a mother versus a father? There's a lot of material impacts of gender that just ideologically trying to abolish gender doesn't really solve.
That is where then like distinction by sex actually comes in. In general, it's like gender doesn't really matter, or it shouldn't matter, like in how you treat somebody and like.
I would agree with the phrasing of shouldn't, but just descriptively speaking, there are many ways that we do that, even like subconsciously, that we're not really aware of, just like subtle ways we treat children differently. Especially like I've seen studies on like how parents interact with like young boys versus young girls, and like even when they're not trying to like treat them in like a gendered way, there are subtle differences in how they will like refer to these children or treat them, especially if say like they're crying or maybe they got hurt. And so like there's a lot of ways that go beyond even what we're just like consciously aware of.
And that's when sex would come into play. Like that's where you would address those differences of like parental leave and things like that. But like there are meaningful ways that you would treat someone differently by sex, not necessarily like in a social setting, but like as a doctor in a progressive society. That's really the only way that someone should be treated differently based off of sex or gender, and in that situation, kind of, then that's where gender wouldn't even be a thing, right?
Right, yeah, and like
And
adding nuance onto that, like our understanding of sex within like a medical or biological context is also going to be impacted by like, if say like a transsexual person transitions hormonally, like they're going to have different medical needs based off how those hormones impact their sex characteristics, and like intersex people obviously. So like this kind of like notion of sex, it would matter in like biological context, like say the doctor's office. But even then, it's not like forming into some kind of binary. Would you like agree with that kind of sentiment?
with sex, as far as how there's like the outside of normal with intersex folks and making it not a perfect binary, is that what you're.
Yeah, both intersex folks and people who medically transition do have a unique combination of sex characteristics that do impact their medical needs.
That does, yeah, I mean that makes sense. I wouldn't say I've thought about that too much, but I generally agree with that, yeah.
If we're at a place where like a really progressive society, gender shouldn't really matter in like how we interact with people. The question is like, okay, so how do we get to this kind of society? How do we make things better for people who are currently victimized by the enforcement of gender roles as well as like material realities that are related to that. How do you meaningfully address that at like a policy perspective from like a gender abolitionist standpoint?
To be perfectly honest, don't know that, that I haven't even thought that far into it from that level. And I guess my
Mhm.
thought would be though, do you think the road towards gender abolition, which I feel like to some degree we're already on, right? Totally aware that there still is, sexism and gender roles and things like that. But I mean,
Mhm.
compared to we were in like the 50s, where it's like a woman had to be in a dress, a woman couldn't wear pants pretty much,
Yeah,
like
no,
that
like
was like
I agree. We've definitely taken a lot of
wild.
steps both socially and legally. I mean, especially nowadays, I think we're seeing the first generation where it's acceptable to be a certain type of feminine man. But nowadays we're starting to see like, the rise of femboys, and everybody loves femboys. We can talk about like, legal steps, women being able to own credit cards, for example. That's one that's come within the past, what, like 50 years only? The point is like, if there are legal steps we can take like that, if like getting rid of, say, like the obscenity laws, which enforce certain types of clothing on people, were a good thing. If we were to extend to today, that would suggest that laws that would say like protect trans people's access to healthcare, non-discrimination provisions, like equal housing, equal employment. Like there's a lot of legal steps we can take to materially move things in a better direction. Saying
Oh,
that
sorry,
like
go
if we
ahead.
can make like legal strides, say like with trans rights, women's rights, etc., then that'll also bring us to a society which is going to be easier to either implement or sway people in kind of like a gender abolitionist fashion.
I don't know what would you describe the other side of like gender ideology or whatnot.
I mean, I would just kind
I
of
got,
label it as like progressive legislation, like generally speaking.
but just for simplicity, for like referring, like if my side, quote unquote, is gender abolition, kind of what you would be arguing for. And I know this is an argument.
My main idea is that these aren't really mutually exclusive in any way, and actually building more
Uh,
progressive trans rights legislation would actually bring us to a society which is more prone to receive and implement gender abolition.
like you see the gender abolition route and the trans rights route, and you see more ways to make an impact through the trans right route because there's like actual policy you can pass and like actions that can be taken. Is that kind of your?
Yeah, we want to make a society where like there's no like you should have to do this because you're gender X or gender Y, but
Uh,
it's pretty hard to implement that in terms of policy other than like some kind of non-discrimination provisions, but that's just kind of where we're overlapping in ideology. But like what kind of like I don't really see any kind of like policy path to implement gender abolition. It's much more of like a social notion which has to be developed over time as society comes to accept people who are gender nonconforming, people who are trans.
okay. We've been moving in this direction, like with gender abolition and kind of like gender roles slowly fading out. And
Mhm.
of course, there was some backlash, cultural backlash, and roadblocks and things like that. The trans movement, like trying to push it from the trans right way, has caused way more cultural backlash to even like the point where it's like, it's absurd, and
Mhm.
really vicious.
You look at the early waves of feminism, like the first wave feminists fighting for women's suffrage,
Oh
or
yeah,
like second
that's a
wave
good
second
point.
wave
Yeah.
feminists in particular were the ones that often fought against like the mandation of gender roles. Like there were pretty similar levels of pushback. Although I think that in our current day and age, like the rise of modern neo-fascism is an additional concern that wasn't as present fighting back against those other movements.
Well, and then what I think is also interesting too is, and correct me if I'm wrong
Hmm.
here, because I'm sure you're going to be much more familiar with this area, but with most of the legislation that's been happening regarding trans issues, hasn't it been like red states stripping stuff back and putting up roadblocks as opposed to like landmark legislation getting passed? Is that is
Both
that a
are
correct
happening,
summary
but
of
it's
kind
on
of?
kind of like a state level. So like in red states, what we're overwhelmingly seeing is red states implementing legislation to roll back trans rights. But then in blue states, we actually see some protective legislation being implemented as well. There's a couple states that have like sanctuary laws where like if you are fleeing from a red state to one of these blue states, because you're like accessing trans healthcare, for example, then that red state
Mhm.
can't persecute you for fleeing that state and getting this like care out of state. There's also like non-discrimination laws which are passing in blue states, as well as I've seen some laws that were attempted but didn't quite pass, which would like allow provisions for like trans minors that had unsupporting parents to like go through some kind of like court mediation to try to get the health care that they need.
We're at this path, either gender abolition or trans rights, and then this goes into which way do we go? And then one of the points that I sent you in my notes is then like, but do we worry that trans rights then hurts the gender abolition movement? Because it does. I mean, I guess I would argue it does to some degree then enforce gender roles, because then it more fixes attributes to a gender, and these like kind of physical things.
Not
like
necessarily.
if we say a man is,
we see like trans people that are very much gender nonconforming, or at least a little bit gender nonconforming, being pretty standard amongst trans people. And also, if you want to talk about like the rise of like people identifying as non-binary and that being widely embraced by the trans community, like there's a lot of support for this idea of like trans people being in line with gender abolition, trans people supporting and they themselves being either non-binary or gender non-conforming. The people that are opposed to trans rights, the people that are opposed to like gender non-conformity, those are largely the same people, like religious conservatives, like far right. Like the types of people that are opposed to like trans people existing and transitioning are also the people that like really want to enforce very rigid gender roles.
But there are those like staunch people, like the very conservative religious folks who aren't interested in budging on either side and want to actually move backwards, and like both areas. And then I think there is this middle ground of a lot of people who are just like not naturally bigots. Let me ask you this: do you think some of the pushback to like identity politics in recent years is understandable?
I think that, as with anything, like people can take like identity politics arguments too far. Like for example, I'm not a big fan of like the kind of like stay in your lane advocacy that a lot of people that are like really, really far on kind of the identity politics side of things will advocate for. Like for example, the idea that like if you're not trans, you shouldn't be talking about trans issues. I'm much more of like a coalition building, like we should be fighting together. We should be uplifting each other's movements, working together, that kind of thing.
There's probably this group in the middle that's maybe a little bit sick of identity politics, but they're generally like not bigots. And, I think they're like myself, where they're like, they don't really get it, but it's like, if you you're not going to hate crime someone. If you see someone, you'll be nice to them, you'll call them by their pronouns.
As with any kind of like topic, I mean, the default state of human understanding is ignorance, and people are generally pro-social. They generally try to, understand and like work with other people. But if you like don't have a lot of like knowledge about, say, like trans people, for example, then you're not going to like understand all the ins and outs of trans identity, for example.
Legislation certainly is a big step, but I think it's also just getting society like willing to take that pill. You know what I mean? And like, I feel like I'm a person who's like very open to it. And then my only real roadblock is I'm just like, but it doesn't make sense, really. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like
what doesn't make sense?
Understand it. Like gender as a concept, and like self-ID, and where it becomes more of like this belief and kind of this,
like,
I almost equate
like
it
gender identity, or
and where I almost like equate it to like a religion or something, where it's like you kind of like have faith in this, or like, I mean, because it really comes down to like, at least my understanding, like a trans person, if they're like born as a female and they feel like a male, it's like they think that they have like a male spirit, essentially.
If you really want to like scrutinize an identity, you can apply a lot of scrutiny to literally any kind of social identity, and it starts to kind of fall apart under a magnifying glass. Like, we could go with the example of like what it means to be goth. Like for some people, like being goth could be a really big part of their identity, how they understand themselves, how they express themselves, who they are. You can start to put that under a magnifying glass and be like, okay, well, like, do you have to like wear this much amount of like black goth clothing to be considered a goth? Do you have to like participate in certain activities? Do you have to follow like certain kind of like moods or personality structures? We could probably find general trends in how goths dress, behave, etc. Yet at the same time, we're not going to find like universals, because any kind of identity you look at under a magnifying glass is going to fall apart really quickly. If this person is using this identity marker just as a tool to understand and express themselves, yet other individuals can choose to embrace or reject that, then I don't see any harm going on, I
don't see the harm in that either. And I think it just even comes down to this, the concept becomes a little like heady and very like philosophical, you know what I mean? Like
That'll happen with
I'm
any
so
identity you
like,
look at, absolutely.
you know, and I'm not gonna dishonestly try and say that you're like comparing uh being trans to like a like being goth or like something like that.
I mean, I think you could draw
But I think,
comparisons. I'm not saying I'm not equating them, but like there are absolutely comparisons you can draw between trans identity and any other social identity.
I may not understand it well enough to have a strong opinion on that, but I think getting like the average Joe to see gender, which for the longest time everyone has assumed is the exact same thing as sex, you know, and that's where I almost like feel like there's some bad marketing or I know that's not exactly, it's not marketing, but kind of like the theory behind trans ideology is like using gender. It's like using a word that everyone has already used for so long to mean sex, and then trying to have it mean something else is just like setting yourself up for failure. You know what I mean? Because
Well, I
most of the
guess
debates that I watch,
my kind of confusion is like if you seem to be really like pro, rhetoric surrounding gender abolition, don't you need to draw the difference between gender and sex in order to like effectively advocate for like gender abolition rhetoric?
I mean that's a good point.
Usually people coming
Um,
to like consciousness about gender abolition would have to come from them first understanding that gender and sex are not the same thing. Like the idea that we ascribe all of these weird, entirely arbitrary social roles based off of whether or not someone was born with a pee or of a goober, like that it is itself recognizing that there's this social stuff, gender, that's different than biological stuff, and from there you can get to the point of, well, why do we really need to enforce social stuff over something biological? Why can't we just let the biological thing exist and let people be free with the social stuff, thus abolishing the gender?
that's an interesting point. I just want to actually ask a side question. I'm not trying to be
Yeah, go for
evasive,
it.
but a side question. Is there, you know, because when I've been looking at some of this stuff, is there a lot of consensus in the trans community on this stuff?
On the idea of gender abolition, or on what in particular?
On like ideology, like what everyone believes, like is gender, is, you know, are they for abolition, like you're saying? Are they
I think you're going to find
'cause
very little consensus on what exactly it means to be this gender or that gender, what exactly it means to like identify as trans or identify as any of these kind of like micro labels that people use to describe their identity. But what you're going to find a lot of agreement on is more like progressive legal rights, things like trans people should be allowed to access bathrooms with the gender they identify with, things like, trans people should be allowed to access medical care, to medically transition if that's what they desire. Like, you're going to find the most agreement on those kind of like legal rights. But when it comes to like specific ideas about like, what aspects of like femininity or womanhood somebody ascribes themselves to, you'll often find that people tend to take more like a pluralistic approach where it's like, this part of gender or femininity or whatever can be really meaningful to me. I really like it. It feels like a way that I can express myself. But for somebody else, that might be totally different. Maybe somebody like really, really doesn't like gender. Maybe they were harmed by gender and they wish to, not really interact with it. And that's cool for them too. And that's how you can have somebody who's like, say, like a very binary trans person who loves being a woman, yet is totally cool with like a non-binary person that's like, I have no gender, do not refer to me, or whatever. Like, I think you'll generally find pretty pluralistic attitudes, where they're like, we can acknowledge that like at the end of the day, because gender is so social, it's so inherently subjective that we just want to make with it what works best for us.
and then just thinking more too about that point that you made, which I think was a good point, and so I've been kind of stewing on that, where you had pointed out that to be against gender roles, you essentially have to acknowledge gender being a thing. At that time, like gender and sex were the same thing. So it'd be sex was our gender roles really is the same thing as sex roles. Those were kind of synonymous.
Yeah, people
Do
largely
you,
use the terms gender and sex synonymously to refer to both biological and social traits. Although
yeah.
if you want to look at like even the earliest of feminist writings, like Mary Wollstonecraft in the 1700s, like she literally wrote about using these terms roughly interchangeably about how so much of gender and so much of sex has literally nothing to do with biology and how like women are, forced to this domestic role
Mhm.
despite not having any kind of like biological limitation that would prevent them from, say, like serving in the military like a man does. Like this idea of there's this social stuff which is separate from the biological stuff, like that's baked
Yeah.
into the heart of even the earliest of feminist writings. So even if we didn't
Mhm.
have like language that we were precisely using to distinguish sex from gender, this idea of the social stuff versus the biological stuff has been an idea that's been floating around in academic circles for hundreds of years.
And that was kind of the point that I was trying to make. I don't know, a couple minutes ago, where,
Hmm.
and this is kind of half baked, just thinking of a point, but that the disservice, gender ideology did using gender, since so many people conflate those two terms, you know what I mean? And then trying to
Hmm.
be like, it means something else, because I feel like 90% of the debates that I've watched on the trans issue is just two people talking past each other, because one person considers gender a social construct, and the other person equates it as sex. You know what I mean? And so it's, you can't be a woman, and the person's like, you know, uh, I'm a trans woman. It's like, and they're like, you physically can't change your sex, and and there's a lot of like talking past each other.
In these kind of debates between like people who are supportive of trans rights and people who are like anti-trans, it seems kind of like the core definitional starting point of that disagreement is that there's a disagreement on the distinction between sex and gender, and so that would highlight
Uh,
that like hammering out the difference between sex and gender is a really important step in creating understanding and like reaching out.
I think a good point to talk about that, kind of like,
Hmm.
I feel like we're naturally in it already. The paradox I was kind of describing in my notes,
Hmm.
where um, because it's like, when a woman says, I'm going, I feel like a man, and like I want to transition into being a man. What do you need to change to become a man? And they're using these gender roles, right? I mean, they're these concepts that have been pushed to us by culture.
Gender in our society also kind of functions as like a language or like a performance. So the idea is that, if you want to be recognized as a man by broader society, then you kind of have to look the part for people to just intrinsically treat you that way. Some of the reasons why, like, say somebody, is freshly out identifying as a trans man, some of the reasons why they might lean kind of harder into some masculine like types of presentation is so that they can get that recognition. And it's also for safety reasons. Like being seen as, say, like a non passing trans person can be pretty dangerous, especially in like more conservative areas. Or if it's not dangerous, then like people often treat you a lot worse if you're perceived as like a non passing trans person versus somebody who's like stealthing under the radar. And so, like, there is both like social consequences and safety consequences towards not performing that gender role well. And I don't think that we should place that blame on trans people because of the society that made them unsafe, that might have caused them to play up their gender performance a little bit for their own safety.
And like, a assigned female as birth, who appears like any other female, or the
Hmm.
average female, and participates and functions in society as, your average female. Um, that could be a man according to gender ideology, because they don't want to be, because I think there is this aspect of like, where gender ideology is like, well, there needs to be, we need to like make these terms like a concept, man and woman, so we need to put some box there. But then if we put the box, then we're like hurting feminists, and we're hurting other progressive causes. So then they're like, then they take the box away. It's like, if you put two boxes on people, like society, of like, one box is man, one box is woman, and that's your gender roles. But then they're like, fuck, well, we don't want to have gender roles. So then you lift up the box, and then they're like, but we want to have gender as a thing. So you see what I'm saying? Maybe that was a bad description.
Not entirely. I guess like it seems kind of like the core kind of problem is like people like understanding gender as an identity is based off of like, well, it's hard to like come up with objective criteria based on identity. I just don't see how that like really matters in like any kind of broader social context. Like the identity based perspective would be more like this. So a trans person becomes the gender that they transition to when they identify as that gender and they believe it for themselves. So like, a trans woman is like, okay, before she transitions, she's like, okay, I've always thought kind of growing up, like, I wished I was a girl. I wanted to be a girl. And now I'm finally going to do it. I'm going to transition. I'm going to be a woman. Most people that are in that position, like, it takes them quite a while to come to terms with that and to fully believe, like, yes, I'm a woman now. Like, for some people, they have their own kind of like internal markers of, well, I will see myself as a woman, like, once I start presenting that way in public, once I start transitioning medically, like, once I have fully internalized that in myself, that, I've done this process of resocialization, people now treat me differently, like, I've gotten used to how people treat me differently. Like, over time, you just come to see yourself that way. And once that is a sincere belief, then for all of your intents and purposes, like, yeah, you're that gender. That's your identity. I think that's kind of beautiful that like people have this tipping point where, they've finally accepted themselves. They finally see themselves for who they are. And it's a really big formative experience for them. And the only place where that could cause problems is like if you don't know what somebody's identity is. But if there's like a context where like you don't know what somebody's identity is and you do need to know, like you could always just ask.
To better describe my point is like
Mhm.
gender, I feel like is inherently regressive or conservative because it establishes roles and ways of dressing, etc., arbitrarily. I feel like just the concept of gender itself is regressive
Okay.
and conservative because it
Let me ask
acknowledges
you a
women
question.
are one way, men are one way. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess my question is if we say that like gender is inherently regressive, like
Mhm.
do we then have like a moral obligation to be gender nonconforming? Do we have a moral obligation to like push those boundaries? Like, what's our moral obligation with respect to how we interact with this kind of regressive societal
I
phenomenon?
don't know, and I mean, I think that's an interesting question because when I'm reading about this stuff or hearing about it, I kind of play these thought experiments in my head, because it's
Mm-hmm.
like what makes me, because what makes me a man, and I don't really have this like strong like, it really for me it comes down to sex, and I'm like, well, why do I so strongly prefer pants and a t-shirt and a hoodie? Why don't I wear a dress?
Mm-hmm.
And like why do I? And I do for the most part adhere to uh, gender norms, pretty strictly. I don't. Uh, and so it's like, what is that? I mean, I think a big part of it is just like, the social pressures and like dating, attracting like, you know, uh,
Mm-hmm.
socially, and
Yeah, and this is the thing that's like really strange to me is that like these pressures you mentioned, the pressures of like being socially accepted, of like, being seen as more attractive, of like having that status that comes with performing gender well, like we tend to really criticize trans people when they follow those kind of roles for those exact same reasons, but we don't tend to do the same thing to like cis people, where it's like you could have a cis woman who she expresses her gender in a very traditionally feminine way. She reaps the social benefits of doing that. And a lot of the people who, kind of like criticize trans people for being like overly feminine or whatever won't bat an eye at the cis woman that did that. And so it's just like it seems like a double standard how we apply this to trans people and not cis people. And this kind of gets to like the core problem with like a lot of these kind of like hardcore gender abolitionist like critiques of trans people is where it's like the people that do this have like a very specific idea of this is the right way to abolish gender. This is the right way to be gender nonconforming, to, fight back against these repressive gender roles. But it's like when you are doing it to the point where you're like policing a trans person's behavior or expression, or you're policing like somebody who might be more kind of traditional in how they express their gender, like you're kind of recreating a new set of gender roles where it's like now the new set of gender roles that I think you have to follow is be non-conforming to the old ones. And like this is how like TERFs will co-opt kind of like gender abolitionist talking points just to reinforce their own idea of gender.
I mean, because let me ask you this. I
Mhm.
mean, like, do you think there's something inherent to being trans, or do you think it's as much as like your environment?
As with all of these things, I think that it's a combination of both the environment that you grow up in, as well as like some innate kind of like biological predispositions based off of things like genes and hormone exposures, like in utero. There is some pretty interesting research that's come out of like the biological sciences, like looking at like brain scans of trans people, looking at like behavior analysis of like children when they're pretty young who like later came out in life as trans. And what we see is like in kind of like terms of some like subtle brain differences, like there's some unique markers that correlate with transness that also tend to correlate with people that identify with the gender that the trans person identifies with. So like we see some brain similarities between like cis
Yeah.
women and trans women, as well as like some behavioral kind of similarities. And we can like locate this in kind of like some physical regions of the brain. Not to say that there's like a one standard pink brain and blue brain. Like the research is a lot more nuanced, kind of the idea that like our brains tend to form this kind of like mosaic of traits. And these mosaic of traits is in no way like binarily distributed. But when you kind of like, shape all of those mosaic traits into like bell curves, you kind of notice like some slight distinctions on average between trans women's brains, and then like cis men's brains, trans men's brains, where we can kind of come up with these kind of like some grouping of characteristics. There's also some kind of like genetic research, which has found a couple of like genes that seem to be correlated with people who are trans, and also some research on like development in utero, where it seems to be the case that like because our bodies develop like physical body before the brain, especially, so like it's mostly during the first trimester where your genitals will start to differentiate, but then it's mostly during like the second trimester where the brain starts to like form into most of what it is. So like the idea is if you had kind of like a more masculinizing hormone wash in that first trimester, then your body, your genitals would start to develop into like a penis and testes. But if you had, more of like a feminizing hormone wash in the second trimester, then you end up with somebody that is more likely to be a trans woman, like where their brain has some like feminizing effects of estrogen in the womb. And we found some kind of like intersex conditions and like genetic factors which can kind of create these hormone structures. And we've also seen this happen in mothers who were prescribed DEH. It was like a really potent form of estrogen that was thought to help them with pregnancy. Mothers who were prescribed that were more likely to give birth to trans women than mothers who weren't. Where like having this added hormone in the utero
Interesting.
environment was more likely to create like children who were trans women.
Science advances and they're like, oh yeah, it's like there are distinct biological characteristics that indicate someone's trans. It's as simple as IDing like the genital sex, at birth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you think that would be a standard for
I
validity?
think it'd be hard to like use it as like a diagnostic, because things like related to the brain tend to be a lot more like complicated and have potentially overlapping effects. So like another example is like there are distinct differences that we notice in the brains of people that had ADHD, like particularly with related to the production of dopamine, as well as like the impulse decision making kind of circuits of the brain. And we can like observe this in brain scans, but just because somebody might have some of those patterns in a brain scan doesn't mean they have ADHD. There are other like potential comorbid factors, like certain forms of addiction can also create like ADHD symptoms. Also, people that have like really bad habits with like screen time, for example, can develop like ADHD like symptoms. And so it's like trying to go from, physical manifestations in the brain back to like the underlying like medical condition. It's not always as clean of a mapping. And so I think that you would probably want to take a nuanced approach of like, say we had like really good brain scanning technology that was also very easily accessible. Like we could do those brain scans and like also combine it with like talk psychotherapy to accurately diagnose people. And I think we'd probably have slightly better results taking a look at kind of more comprehensive, both like talk therapy and kind of like brain structures, because that kind of might give you some ideas of like conditions to look for.
I feel in certain communities, it's more accepted, if not maybe encouraged, amongst some like younger kid groups. And so, like, potentially some social contagion, like how you see, I don't know, I read something on TikTok where it's like during COVID, there's this huge spike in young girls with
The
Tourette's.
idea of like social contagion. I mean, if you're talking about like with respect to trans people, the only people that have attempted to research like social contagion in trans people were pretty explicit anti-trans bigots. That the only research they could like come up with to support their hypothesis was actually conducted on transphobic parents of trans kids, where they were asking the parents like, "Hey," and literally they recruited these parents from www.transgendertrend.com, asking them like, "Hey, do you think that being trans is like a social contagion?" And the transphobic parents said, "Yeah." The kind of like academic basis for this idea with respect to trans people, there's no data to support this. But the idea of like social contagion or like people faking, say, like mental illnesses being a phenomenon, like that is true. But here's the thing: like if somebody say like starts faking an illness or a disorder because of exposure on TikTok,
Mhm.
say like the example of Tourette's. This person,
Yeah,
while they don't have Tourette's, they
they have
do
another
have a
disease.
different
Yeah.
mental illness, and in
Yeah.
either way, like getting them into psychotherapy is the right thing for them. And so, I think psychotherapists should be, mindful, and help people like explore these things. But, if somebody is actually having Tourette's or, is faking Tourette's, like either way, getting them into a psychotherapist is the best thing you can do for them.
Do you think someone could solely have it be their environment is what influences them to be a transgender person?
Honestly, I don't think there's a way that we could ever know. But I guess like my broader question is like, suppose that were the case, would that
Uh,
really matter? Like, suppose you had somebody who, due to environmental social reasons, like they believe that they're trans and they transition and they're happy with it, they're healthy. I mean, people said the same thing about like gay people, for example. Like, oh, it was the environment that like made them gay. And
mhm.
like I guess my point in either case would be like, so what? Like, even if somebody like grows up to be gay or trans and like there were environmental influences that led them to that, as long as this person's living a happy, healthy life, and they've like come to terms with their identity and they're not harming anyone else, like I don't have any issue with that. And ultimately, like trying to pinpoint like, is this biological or is this sociological? Like, how much of it is environmental versus innate? Like, we're never gonna pinpoint those down exactly. So like, I don't know, who cares, right?
Where part of this is where I'm going. The thing I would be the most reluctant about would be like a bunch of surgeries, because I'm
Hmm.
leery of any surgery. I've hurt myself many times, and I've always like tried to do the PT before the surgery because it can just lead to a negative quality of life. The youth, where I sometimes wonder, like, if it is somewhat social, which I think it is to some degree, could you try and like counsel them out of that? Where you don't have to say you have to be, if it's a guy, you don't have to be like you have to do it, these standard gender roles. But I think it'd be more like you're free to be whoever you want to be.
That's what like talking with a gender therapist is like, where
Uh-huh.
they tell you, like you're free to be whoever you want to be. They help you explore like, your identity, why you identify that way, how you want to express that identity, and potential options that are available. And like the whole surgery point is another one where like there is this immense, massive, massive double standard. Like we can talk about so many surgical procedures, ranging from things like boob jobs, nose
Yeah.
jobs, like knee replacement surgery, even things that are routinely performed on like minors. I know that like it's relatively easy for like a cisgender minor to get like a nose job. Yet
Mhm.
that's a surgery that has a regret rate of like 15%. It has
Yeah.
a revision rate of like 10%, complication rate of like 8%.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, if you want to talk about like trans surgeries, like the regret rate for trans surgeries across the board is like less than 1%. Similar like and pretty low complication rates, at least for like trans feminine bottom surgery as well as like trans masculine top surgery. The amount of screening, of consultation, of like therapy that people should go through before they get surgery, say like as a minor. Maybe the truth is that like cis people need a lot more therapy and screening. Like the fact that, a 16-year-old girl could get a nose job without any kind of like therapist letter, that could potentially be a real problem. But as things stand, like right now, trans people, especially trans minors, are required to go through so much screening and like mental health, like therapy letters, doctor consultations before they're allowed to access these surgeries. And ultimately, I think it's kind of like a case by case basis. There are plenty of trans people, and the other thing that people forget about trans youth is like if we were to, as a society, give these trans youth access to like puberty blockers earlier, as well as like hormones around like say early kind of teenage years, like that would actually reduce the need for surgery in a lot of cases. Like if you have a trans man who is able to go on puberty blockers and then take testosterone, like he'll never grow boobs, and so there's no need for him to get top surgery because he'll just never grow boobs in the first place. If we were to do the less extreme interventions earlier, like puberty blockers, we can actually reduce demand for surgery down the road. And yeah, I'm willing to talk about the nuances of the surgery issue. I think, like I said, it's kind of a case by case basis. One example that like we actually pretty normalize surgery amongst minors is like cleft lip surgery, where it's like because of this physical abnormality, is like really really like dissuaded socially. Like we usually allow minors to get cleft lip surgery to give them a normal looking lip, and like that's an instance where it seems that like the social ostracization of looking abnormal like really negatively impacts people's mental health. For trans surgery, it's going to depend more on like kind of the person. Like some trans people have like very debilitating physical dysphoria where it's like just like an utter disgust response at their genitals, whereas other trans people are like, I kind of like my girl cock, like especially after taking estrogen. I really like the way it feels and how it's kind of changed a bit with estrogen. I'm a gawk gobbler.
At that point, if my daughter was like, I need a nose job to fit, like to be happy, I would break. Same if it was like a transgender child being like, I need to pursue like gender affirming care to not kill myself. I'd be like, well, that's obviously the preferred route,
In either case where you have a child that's like, suffering with an extreme dysphoria, whether it's like a gender dysphoria or say like nose job dysphoria, like in either case, you'd want to take them to a therapist, have them talk it out. And like, you as the parent can also talk to the doctor, assess like, is this something that's like really medically necessary? Is this something that's going to have a profound impact on their mental health? Or is this the kind of like case where, maybe we do with like a less risky intervention, say like maybe this girl needs to talk about like her issues with her body image, about like the nose job, or, maybe this trans person doesn't really have that intensive dysphoria, and maybe we'll like hold off on surgery until they're an adult, and like we can talk about puberty blockers or hormones now, but it seems like they're the type of person that could wait until they're 18 plus to make that kind of decision.
If it was an option, what I would prefer is a society that accepts those things, and
hey, me too.
Like,
absolutely.
So do you think we should move into a society like the trans ideology is somewhat of, it's like just a patch on the whole gender roles?
Ultimately, trans people are just trying to do what's best for them. And like, I think you do make a pretty strong point that like, it can feel like a patch because like trans people are often some of the people who are victimized most by like our societal enforcement of gender roles. And I do think that this is probably a pretty commonly shared belief amongst trans people, that like if we as a society were a lot more lax about gender roles, or if we had like abolished gender roles entirely, that like the pressure to conform and the desire for like certain forms of surgeries would probably go down a bit amongst trans people. Like, I think that is absolutely true. Unironically, talking about the joys of girl cock is a good thing for society that will help, like, trans people, especially those who have less bottom dysphoria. Girl cock is awesome. Embrace the gawk if you love it. You know what I mean? I think that, like, in your brain, you've kind of seen, like, trans rights and gender abolition maybe as, like, a dichotomy or, like, a diverging two roads. I think is some like, symbology you've used. But, like, we kind of want both. Like, both lead towards the same goal, towards making society better for some of the people who are victimized the most by gender as it currently exists.
A trans person's experience, what is like their bigger concern? Being able to like live as freely like as they want, dress how they want, function in society as they want, or be affirmed through gender in a genderless society. And and we just refer to each other as like by, he and her refers to like sex.
I don't think they
Someone
would have pronouns relating to sex in like a gender abolished society. Because like, how would you know someone's sex in a gender abolished society? How we like, I see somebody at the store, they look like a guy, which I'm mostly reading through social cues and like presentation, and then I call him he. Like, how would we do that in a gender abolished society? I think it would probably be like a single gender neutral pronoun.
I was reading some like forum about, and it was on the topic of gender abolition, and there was like a trans woman on there who was like, no, like fuck this, I don't want to like they're very anti it. And I guess it is a turf talking point more or less. They were like very much like, I don't want to just be seen as some like amorphous, like asexless, thing. I want to be seen as a woman, as a like beautiful, it's like, and I read that and I kind of felt, sad for them in a way, because they seemed very like hopeless, because they're like, it was like they weren't trying to change their gender. It was like they're trying to change their sex. I'm like very sad about that. You know what I mean?
For some people, like their gender is going to be a lot more core to their identity, to how they express themselves than other people. And, I think that this is absolutely shaped by like the society we live in. So like in a society that places such a strong emphasis on gender, like it can feel like a lot bigger of a deal, especially as like a trans person who's been victimized by gender her whole life, who's finally like come to a point where she can actually enjoy it. The pro gender side of this would be saying that like, okay, if we eliminate, like the expectation of gender, but yet still allow people to experience gender as a form of play, as a form of expression that people like, isn't that just like a fun thing that people enjoy? A goth might enjoy like, wearing a very gothy outfit. And it's a form of like play for them, like trying to come up with the best goth outfit. Like, do we really need to like eliminate goth identity because like there's no like, coherent or like universal standard for it? Or rather just like, I don't know, if this person's having fun playing the way they are, like, good for them. I think that we can fight both of these rhetorical fronts. Like, we can fight the rhetorical front of gender abolitionism, and it's going to be very convincing to some people. We can also fight the rhetorical front of like, hey, our society like really victimizes trans people, and we can build a better society. Like, we can do both of these at the same time, and different styles of rhetoric are going to appeal to different people who broadly want the same outcomes. And so, like, having different rhetorical approaches, having this kind of like diversity of tactics is actually a good thing for bringing more people over.
There's a big TV announcement. Hey, everybody, gender is over. You're free to do as you like. We are no longer referring to gender. We are just referring to sex. And like going forward, would you be okay in that society? Because and that would essentially mean receiving assigned sex at birth, like pronouns, things like that.
No, because I'm not the same as I was as like my assigned sex at birth. Like, as somebody who's transitioned, like I am both physically different. I am physically different than the sex characteristics I was born with, and also like, in terms of how I operate in society, like I take on a different role than what I was born as. Like, that's just like telling me to revert back to a different thing. That's just no longer true. Like, that would be restricting my expression.
You do see sex as something you can change?
Yeah, at least in terms of some sex characteristics. Like, when we refer to sex, we broadly refer to lots of characteristics, like a whole cluster of characteristics. We might be talking about chromosomes, we might be talking about hormones, we might be talking about like, the presence of external anatomical features. We might be talking about like reproductive capacity. A lot of those are things that will change if you medically transition. If you start taking estrogen, you will grow boobs because everybody has like a biologically encoded breast size that is dependent on the hormones that are in your body as to whether or not you'll develop it.
Do you describe your sex as female?
I would say that I'm a transsexual female. I think that's a more accurate way to describe the biological reality of how my sex has changed from transitioning.
I don't know anything really. On the actual science side, I don't know anything on this topic.
This is the perspective that's adopted by like mainstream biological sciences. The idea that like sex refers to a cluster of characteristics, and that like trans people and intersex people are going to have unique medical needs because they don't fit uniquely into one cluster or the other. They're going to have some characteristics from both clusters. In this future genderless society, pronouns would be essentially useless because if you could appear any way you wanted to, you're not going to know who's assigned male or female at birth, right? Mm-hmm. Isn't that almost like today how it is as well, though, too? If you go out into like the general public, and you just like look at people, you can generally tell, okay, woman, man. But usually the way that you do this will like include trans people based off of how they present themselves. So like especially like a trans woman who's medically transitioned, who's presenting femininely, like your brain's gonna see all of the like external female sex characteristics, like she's got breasts, for example. You're gonna see like the feminine clothes she's wearing, and your brain's gonna go woman. So like um, that's kind of how our brains work with respect to that right now. And there are definitely cases where like it can be really hard to tell. I know I brought up the example of like, there's some tomboys and twinks that like definitely cross the middle of the boundary where it's like I couldn't tell if they're a tomboy, lesbian, butch lesbian, or like just a feminine twink gay man or whatever.
I'm thinking the like self ID where it's like, the kind of conservative talking point. I could be like, I'm a woman now, and I know that's kind of mocking the belief, but I mean, you do believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but like you could see someone on the street, even though they present as atypical of the gender they were assigned with at birth,
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't be able to correctly gender them with certainty, right?
Yeah, like obviously you can't see somebody's identity, and like trans people know this. That's why trans people who are like early in transition will either like just not care how people refer to them while they're still kind of in that process, or like they'll maybe like only request in like circles of friends that like they know, like, oh hey, I'm transitioning, I'd really appreciate if you like called me this, or even like they might even approach like I'm interested in trying out new pronouns. That's another one that sometimes you'll see. Like, and if somebody like comes to me genuinely doing that, I have no problem at all. And I mean, like even in public, if I were to like gender someone some way, and they're like, oh, actually, I'm a guy, I'd be like, oh, my bad, dude, and like just move on.
Do you make a distinction between like those two people, like you and
Yeah,
I know
think
there
that
is like
just like how you can draw this distinction between sex and gender, you can also like draw distinguishing terminology of transsexual and transgender, where like transsexual refer to somebody who takes like steps to medically transition to change some of their sex characteristics. Meanwhile, transgender is somebody who wants to socially transition, change their kind of like social role, identify as a different gender. Most often, you'll find that people are both transsexual and transgender, but it's possible for someone to be one but not the other. Like, for example, say like there's a non-binary person who doesn't medically transition, they would be transgender but not transsexual. And yeah, it's all good. There's just lots of different ways to be trans, to be a person, to exist in society, and I'm all for whatever makes people happy. Just having this kind of language really only matters in like a medical context, where like that's why I would say like if I'm going to a doctor, I would tell them that I'm a transsexual female. That way they can more accurately understand the reality of my sex characteristics.
I feel like I've actually learned a bit and kind of like some stuff to stew on for sure. So I
Awesome.
hope,
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I definitely think you came into this conversation in good faith, and always love to have like an honest and open conversation discussion. I think there's a chance that Hunter is non-binary, but has never considered it. He said a couple of kind of like non-binary eggy things when talking about like why he presents as a man. And I don't know how much he's thought about that. I don't understand why like people like being men. Like, why do people think that it's easier to be a man? I hate being a man.